Good morning. This morning our reading is going to be from Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 33. Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for it, that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the word, that he might present it to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man ever yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it, even as the Lord the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall be joined unto his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let every one of you in particular so love his wife, even as himself, and the wife see that she reverence her husband. This is the word of God.
All right, so let's get right into it. We're going to try to cover quite a bit of ground today. I'll just warn you right now that there is no way I'm going to be able to explain what I would like to explain without anyone feeling a little bit maybe at loss of trying to understand exactly what we're saying. It's a very complex issue, and so I'm going to do my best, and I hope that you'll be, like Mike talked about last week, we'll keep an open mind, hear me out. If we get to the end and it still doesn't make sense to you, then maybe we're wrong, and that's certainly something you need to consider. But hear me out to the end, and then if you have any questions, you can approach me, or you can text me on Mattermost or whatever. I'd be happy to try to explain it more. Let me just quickly recap this text where we're at. Mike read the same text, and instead of dividing and one of us speaking of the women and the other of the men, which really is not what this text is really about, we wanted to do it where we just both spoke on the same general topic that the text is dealing with. And so I just want to give you three very quick points to kind of recap where Mike was last week and kind of point you where we're going this week. First is this text is dealing with universal mutual submission. And not just this one, but all of what is often called the domestic duties. You have to the parents and the children, to the slaves and the masters. It's talking about what the Roman household or the Greco-Roman household would look like. Way back 26 weeks ago when we started this series, right? We talked about that paterfamilias, that extended family that wouldn't just be blood relatives. It would be the slaves. It would be all the clients. It would be everyone involved, everyone who, it basically think of the family, not the way we do today in the Western society where it's dad, mom, and kids, but think of the family as a small family business. That's really what a family was. It was the small family business run out of the home with the paterfamilias, the head of the household, at the top of that. And that could include several nuclear families involved in there. So when Paul is talking about these family things, he's speaking to that into the context of this large business. What we would now call a small home business. He's talking into that context. So it's very important to understand that. And what he says is that this entire family thing that's going on has to be reimagined or reinterpreted in the lens of universal mutual submission. That's why the text starts, and this is a very notorious transition in Ephesians. All the commentators look at it and struggle with it. It's very difficult. It isn't clear in the text where one sentence begins and the one ends and the other begins. It isn't clear where one sentence ends and the other begins. It says, submit yourselves all one to another, and wives submit to your husbands. And in some manuscripts, that second word submit isn't even in the manuscripts. It's all one sentence. And others, they have copied the verb, or the verb is in the second verse, which is wives submit. That verb is there, submit is there. But it's whether the verb is there or not in the manuscript, it's clear that Paul is seamlessly transitioning from the previous paragraph into this one, and we are to look at submission as being the umbrella under which all of these domestic duties are to be understood. Submitting yourselves one to another. This is a blanket, universal, mutual statement. Everybody's included here. And this is not an odd statement. Let me just very quickly point this out. This is not unique or some way strange. Peter does the same exact thing in his epistle. In 1 Peter chapter 5, he's speaking about the leadership of the church and of the elders, and he says this in chapter 5, verse 5. He says, likewise, ye younger, meaning in context, ye younger elders, submit yourselves to the older elders, right? Yea, all of you be subject one to another. So here we have almost the exact same thing that Paul is saying. He says, younger ones submit to the older, but everyone submit to each other. This is what we have also in Ephesians. Paul says, all of you submit to each other, and wives submit to your husbands. So one does not negate the other. It is to all be understood under this umbrella thing of universal mutual submission. Second thing is that what Paul is talking about here ultimately is far greater than just marriage. In fact, he says, I'm not even talking about marriage. I'm talking about Christ and the church. So we have to understand that Paul sees marriage and children and even slavery in every human relationship. He sees it that there is an ideal version of that, an ideal instance of all of those relationships that is Christ and the church, and they're all meant to reflect that perfect ideal relationship. And so what he's saying is that Christians should be taking the Christ mindset and instantiating it in every relationship they have. What should your marriage look like? Like Christ. What should your business look like? Like Christ. What should your parenting look like? Like Christ. The real relationship is not the marriage relationship. It's not the child-parent relationship. It's not the master-slave relationship. The real relationship from which all others are merely shadows of is Christ and the church. That's the real thing. That is true reality. Everything else is like a massive stage play in which roles are assigned and you play out a role, not because you are inherently unworthy of some other role. You understand that when a director casts actors, he casts maybe a principal actor. The lead of the play, the main character will be Adrian. And then he'll have a small role, and he'll cast Kelly in a small role. That isn't because Kelly is any worse of an actor than Adrian. It is because there are different roles, and every role must be filled. And the director, for whatever reason he has, prefers one person or another. And it is very common. It is very common, using our metaphor, for roles that have extremely limited screen time to win Academy Awards. It doesn't matter that they are only on the film for a few brief minutes. God has cast us all in roles. It's not because women or men or adults or children or masters or slaves are inherently unworthy of another role. God has put you in the role He thinks you are best in. All right. Third thing real quick is that what Paul is saying is counterintuitive and countercultural. Super important to understand that. He is not saying, Hey, you Greco-Romans, you got women under submission, carry on. That is not what Paul is saying. If that was what he's saying, he wouldn't need to write Ephesians to say it. And he certainly wouldn't need to say that he has to invoke all the greatest wisdom that heaven can offer for you to understand it. Because they all understood this already. And he isn't saying, hey, Greco-Roman world got it right, but you Christians are being rebellious, and you need to get the women and the children and the slaves under submission. That is not what Paul is saying. He is saying something that is so incredibly different, category-busting, countercultural, counterintuitive, that he prays for 4 chapters that God would fill them with wisdom that is so beyond our understanding and our realities and our dimensions that we could just be able to maybe glimpse in and see the complexity of what is going on here. So if your understanding of Ephesians 5 is not monumentally complex, you have misunderstood it. If it does not tax your understanding, you have not understood it. When Paul says that it is beyond comprehension and it is beyond what anyone can understand, this is what he's talking about. And if it isn't that way for you, you have not understood Ephesians 5 and 6. Okay. A common indictment on this passage and of Paul, and I've read a whole bunch of books over these past few weeks on this. There's a lot of them. Some defending Paul, some indicting Paul, but all of them looking at it saying, why didn't Paul, for instance, issue an emancipation proclamation right here? Here he has this opportunity. He's going to deal with women. He's going to deal with children. He's going to deal with slavery. We've talked about this in the first one. You can go back and listen to it if you missed it or you forgot. But children were dealt with and treated horribly in the Greco-Roman society. They were aborted. The abortion was more common in those days than it is today, even though it was incredibly dangerous for the lives of the mothers. And if they weren't aborted, they were exposed. In fact, the birth rates in Rome itself was so low that one of the principal reasons that Rome was destroyed was because of their demographic collapse. They had to import massive amounts of immigrants in order to keep up their demographics because they had killed all of their children. So you think, well, Paul's going to deal with these issues. Surely Paul is going to just say, hey, cut all that out. We're going to get rid of all this. That's not what he does. Slavery. Why didn't Paul say slavery is evil? Emancipate your slaves. So there's a lot of criticism. This criticism is out of bounds. It doesn't take into account the complexity of what Paul is dealing with. It doesn't take into account the reality of who Paul and the churches were. It is an anachronistic, what C.S. Lewis one time called chronological snobbery. They're just, it's like, there's very little difference between saying, why didn't Paul ban slavery, and saying, why didn't he go down to the United Nations Human Rights Council and file a complaint? Because it didn't exist. Do you realize that there was nowhere on earth at that time where slavery was not practiced? Nowhere. Even in the Americas, yet undiscovered by Europeans, slavery was everywhere. It was the way of life. It was as natural as any relationship you experience today. And to imagine a world without slavery was to imagine something that was simply unthinkable. Which by definition, unthinkable means unimaginable. You might as well wonder, why didn't Paul airlift Dorcas and Eutychus to the Metro Trauma Center to have them helped? Paul did not have the power to emancipate anybody. These churches were tiny communities of people who had zero political power. And slavery wasn't just something that someone else did. It was a foundational principle of the Greco-Roman society and of Rome's power structure at the very core. And anybody came in talking about freeing slaves was immediately viewed as seditious by the Roman government. Do you realize that Paul didn't even try to emancipate Onesimus, who was a slave of a close friend of his, but rather pleaded for him? Power even in that situation. Much less to say we're going to end slavery in the Roman Empire. Other than that, emancipation is a feature of politics. It is a function of politics. That is a political issue. Jesus made it clear you can be free politically and be a slave from the time you were born. And Paul is concerned with those things that are a function of the spiritual, not the political. Legal prohibitions are necessary. I'm not saying we shouldn't have laws against slavery, or we shouldn't have laws against abuse, of course we should, but you need to understand, no law ever made people good. And all Christians who have read Paul's writings in Romans should understand that principle clearly. Law does not make people good. It condemns people who are bad. And what Paul is interested in Ephesians is not condemning those who are bad. It is explaining to the Ephesians how they can be good. I've used this example before. I'll use it again. Here in America, we don't need a law that says you're not allowed to eat dog meat because no one's interested. That's right. But if everybody here just loved the taste of dog meat, no amount of laws in the world would ever change people eating their dogs. That's right. All right. However, given all that, it is a mistake to believe that Paul was merely towing the party line of the Roman Empire. He was not saying, hey, these social evils are with us to stay. We're just going to have to get used to them. Just, oh well, if you're a woman, tough luck. If you're a child, oh well. If you're a slave, what can you do? No. Paul here is calling for massive revolution. I would tell you that Paul here is fomenting bloody revolution. Just not the kind of bloody revolution that you might think. It's not the bloody revolution where you shed the blood of your enemies. It's a whole different kind of revolution. It's a more revolutionary revolution. It's where instead of killing your enemies, you mortify yourself. Where the blood that is shed is your own. You sacrifice. You humble yourself to them. Now that's revolutionary. He wants them to understand that this revolution is going to begin in the home. It's going to be done within the small, tight-knit communities of Christians. They're going to live this revolutionary life with their spouses, with their children, with their slaves, with their bosses, with their masters, with everybody, with the empire. They're going to live a revolutionary way. They're going to say, within the categories of the Roman Empire, we do not comply. They're going to live out Jesus' teaching that they should be servants, not rulers. And so he opens this whole discussion up with verse 21. Submitting yourselves one to another. Who? Everybody. Not just wives, everybody. Mike talked about this last week. We're emphasizing it again. Yes, wives, submit to your husbands. That's true. And husbands, submit to your wives. Now that's harder to stomach for some of you. You might think that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so let's not think about it right now in husbands and wives. Let's briefly just say it looks a lot clearer if we were to say, masters, submit to your slaves. That's a little more, at least it's more palatable. But how about this? Here is where it gets very clear. Parents, submit to your children. Now that's not actually very hard to understand at all. You might right now be thinking, oh, that doesn't make sense. Really? Let me put it this way. The closest thing to a slave in a modern Western society is a parent. That is the closest thing to slavery that any of us could ever imagine or experience. Parents know that. I'm not joking. It's funny, but it's serious. It's true, That child, think about how he's treated. You tell me what emperor of whatever far-flung kingdom is hand-fed, hand-washed, hand-carried for years of his life. All he has to do is go, and you're right there to give him something. And then at the end of the week, you give him money. Now that's slavery. You're saying parents aren't submissive to their children? Of course they are. And I'm not saying that in any negative way. I'm saying that now Western society has so deeply adopted Paul's teachings and Jesus' teachings on these issues that we do not think that children are disposable. We do not think the way Romans thought, that until they are of age, until they're like 21 or 31 years old, or whatever age they consider to be of age, it kind of varies, but until they're in their late or early 20s, you can just kill them if you get in the way. Western society says no. Parents exist to protect and to nurture and to love and to care for and to grow up their children to be successful. And he says, and children aren't supposed to save up money for the parents. Parents do it for the children. That's not how the world looked at it. Do you know why they wanted to have children? To provide for themselves. Paul says, no. We have children so we can provide for them, not so that they can provide for us. Children aren't a retirement plan. They're our investment in the future. Now, when we look at it with children, we say, okay, now that makes sense. Well, there's no difference. There's no difference between you looking at it with parents and children and looking at it with husbands and wives, or slaves and masters. The problem is that Western society has failed to understand properly what submit means, probably all societies. Submission is not subjugation. And it's super important you understand that. Subjugation is external. Submission is internal. Subjugation is against your will. Even if you're the one subjugating yourself, you're telling yourself, I'm going to do what my husband says, even though I don't want to. That's subjugation. I'm going to do what the master says, even though I don't want to. Subjugation. That's not submission. Submission is, I want what my wife wants. I want what my children want. I want what my slaves want. Their will matters to me. Their best interests is my desire. Let me try to illustrate this difference with two illustrations. One is urban legend. As far as I can find out, never really happened, but it illustrates. And another is a true story. So the urban legend. The urban legend, there's different time periods where it is. You can find it all the way back to the Korean War. Generally, it's typically told about Vietnam or Iraq, but let's just say it's Korea. So the urban legend is that when American soldiers got to Korea before the war, they found that Korean women walked 10 paces behind their husbands. It was a matter of subordination, knowing your place. After the war, things had changed so dramatically that now the women walk 10 paces in front of their husbands. And when asked what Western virtue transformed society so dramatically, the answer was landmines. That's subjugation. I'll give you a true story that illustrates submission. The great Baptist preacher, E.V. Hill, recently deceased, when his wife died, he preached one of his most famous sermons at her funeral. And in it, he told a story about, one of the stories he told, about his wife to illustrate who she was as a person, and as a woman, and as a wife. And he says this: "One week when I had received quite a few death notices, and one night when I had received a notice that I would be killed the next day, I woke up thankful to be alive. But I noticed that my wife was gone. And I looked out the window, and my car was gone. And I went outside, and finally she drove up in her robe. And I said, 'Where have you been?' She said, 'It occurred to me that they put a bomb in that car last night. And that if you had gotten in there, you might have been blown away. So I got up and I drove it. And it's all right.'" Now that's submission. Do you understand the difference? Being subjugated, being submitted. It isn't just because she's a woman that it's submission. It would have been submission if it had been his son, or if he had done it for his wife, or if his employee had thought about it and got in the car and drove it around the block. It wouldn't matter who had done it. What are they doing? They are saying, my will, my desire is for your best interests. I don't care about me. I care about you. That's submission. Brethren, submit yourselves one to another. But our first question when we read Ephesians 5, you know what it is? Or our first questions, the same ones the Ephesians had. Who's in charge? Who makes the final decision? That's what I want to know. Who serves whom in this relationship? That's because, like Timothy Keller points out in many of his messages, one of the hallmarks of Western civilization is that all our relationships are transactional. They're all about what you get out of it. Does it make me happy? Does it fulfill me? Does it serve my interest? Who's in charge? Who makes the final decision? Who reigns supreme? Those are transactional questions. Paul envisions the world in Ephesians as everybody fighting and clawing to get to the top of the pile. And he proposes a different reality. Don't swim to the top. Sink to the bottom. Imagine yourself in a ship that has been sunk. Your lungs are burning. Everything in you says, claw your way to the top. That's where salvation lies. And Jesus and Paul and Peter and all the New Testament writers are telling you, go to the bottom. Go to the bottom. Goes against everything in your nature to do. Why do you think Paul prayed for supernatural wisdom? Because it's not what we would do naturally. This is the bloody revolution Paul is fomenting. And the first place that he sees this taking root is in marriage. It's not the only place, but it's the first place. He looks at marriage and says, it needs to start right here. Wives need to submit, not be subjugated. This was a huge problem in Roman society. Women did what they were told, but they were extremely conniving and underhanded. It wasn't because they're women, it's because when you put somebody in the position of having to do what they're told against their wishes, you are not going to get the finest performance. That is not the way to get a good marriage. This is the problem with these trad relationships. They basically want God to be the policeman that forces my wife to love me, as if that is going to produce love ever. No, women were conniving and underhanded, and they had infinite ways of undercutting their husbands in front of his clients, which destroyed his reputation and could lead to his demise. Imagine an entire society that basically operates like the mafia in the Godfather movies, where respect is everything. Paul's not telling women, do what you're told. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, treat your husbands like the church should treat Christ. And he's not telling husbands, throw the little lady a bone every now and then. That's not what he's saying. Try not to be too rough on her when you tell her what to do. This is not what he's saying. He's saying that the husband should think of the wife in the way that Jesus thinks of the church. That wives should submit, should serve. Let me put it in different words. Wives should serve the best interest of their husbands because they want to. And husbands should submit, should serve the best interest of their wife because they want to. The greatest expression of submission is love. Look what it says. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. No man ever hated his own flesh, but he nourishes it and cherishes it, even as the Lord the church. And then look how he finished. For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and she be joined to his wife, and they two shall be one flesh. You see what he's saying? He's saying all of this is about unity. It's not about equality. I'm not here preaching about egalitarianism. If you don't know what that term means, it's a fancy term that's used today in this conversation. Should women submit to their husbands or not? Are husbands the ones that make the final decision or not? It's complementarianism and egalitarianism. I am not advocating either. I'm telling you they both have not understood the text. That's right. The point of the text is not who's in charge. It is about becoming one person. I never ask myself who's in charge of myself. I wonder who's in charge of me. Who makes the final decision? That's a dumb question. It's inane. It's silly. I'm in charge of me. There's only one me. He says the husband and wife are to come together and become one flesh, one person, one will, one mind, one purpose, one mission, one bank account. Asking who's in charge, who decides, who's in control, that's just inane questions in a real marriage. Those don't mean anything. I've given my whole life to my wife. If she wants the money, it's hers already. I don't have anything that's mine. If I wanted my stuff, I wouldn't have gotten married. That's when it was mine. I got married precisely because I was tired of a life where all is mine. It's an empty, vain, worthless life where it's just about me. I wanted a life that was fuller, grander, greater, deeper. And so now I'm going to worry about what's mine and what's yours. That's getting married and having separate bank accounts, let's say, put it in that context. That's having the worst of both worlds. all the problems of marriage and none of the benefit. The benefit is I have an extension of myself and am an extension of her, in which we both are pursuing the same things. We are doubling our energies in the same goal. And if I have to tell her what it is and make her do it, that's not the same goal.
That's right.
That's not submission. Paul's teaching that marriage is entering this new state, this new type of humanity. Reimagined. It's not a quantitative change. I didn't get married and become two.
That's right.
And I didn't get married and become half, like some of these women on Twitter are like, I get married and now I'm half of what I used to. That's all nonsense. It doesn't even make sense mathematically. You can't think of it that way. Math isn't the right context. The right context is categories. When I got married, I went out of one category and went into a different one. And I wanted to do that. It's like what Paul is doing here and what God is doing in Ephesians. He's opened up this door, like a Narnia door, and you're looking through this opening into a world that's beautiful and wonderful and great. And he's saying in that world, you can be fully satisfied. Why? Because you will be fully satisfying somebody else. And we stand there and look at that and go, wow, who's in charge? Sounds great. Who makes the final decision? And God is face-palming. You don't understand. Jesus is the ultimate expression of what we're talking about. That's what Paul is saying in Ephesians. Think about how Jesus stands in stark contrast with, for instance, Adam. Go look at the Genesis account of the fall. Adam, what does he do? He throws Eve under the bus. They become disunited. They become two people. He's the blame, she's the blame, and they're casting blame, and they're not working together. Jesus comes as the second Adam, and he doesn't throw the church under the bus. He throws himself in front of it.
That's right.
He's not trying to figure out who's to blame and who's in charge. He wants to cover the church, clothe it, clean it, save it, sanctify it, exalt it, glorify it. You think Jesus did all that because he wanted to be in charge? He already was in charge. He didn't come to rule the church. He could rule the church from heaven. He came to serve the church. And the church responds by reverencing and serving him, not transactionally. This is incredibly important. This is not a transactional relationship. It says that Jesus died for us while we were yet sinners, no personal benefit to himself. And we don't love Christ for personal benefit. We're already accepted in the beloved. This isn't a transaction. This is mutual submission. The giving of yourself, of your will, your I, your me, your ego. The giving, the total surrender of yourself to another. And Paul says that's what marriage should look like Jesus and the church. Tim Savage wrote Power Through Weakness. He writes in that, he says, according to Philippians 2, Jesus incarnated the perfect image of God in his self-giving, in contrast to Adam's falling short of the glory of God because of his self-grasping. That's the difference. If you're living in a marriage where it's all about who's in charge, who's in control, who's the boss, you're living in a self-grasping marriage. What am I going to get out of this? Where's my place? But if you are properly following the example of Jesus, it's not about what you can get, but what you can give. Michelle Lee Barnwell, in a great book called Neither Complementarian Nor Egalitarian, says that ultimately what it comes down to is that we must reverse the expectations of personal gain from our positions. Let me say it again, we must reverse the expectations of personal gain that we can get from our positions. Marriage is not about how it benefits me. Proper biblical marriage that truly reflects the image of Jesus in the church, it's about how can I benefit my wife. When we look at Jesus' behavior in the church, do you really think the most appropriate question is, who's in charge? So you're going to look up at the crucified Savior hanging on the cross for the church and say, excuse me, I just need to know who's going to make the final decision. That seems appropriate. Yes, he's Lord. Absolutely. That's the point he makes when he says, and I've washed your feet. I'm Lord, and I've humbled myself. And now I want you all to humble yourselves, one with another, everybody. You think, well, that was just between preachers. No, it wasn't. It's everybody. Men, women, children, everybody. Masters and slaves, everybody. We are going to radically revolutionize every aspect of humanity because it's fallen humanity living in transactional relationships. And we're going to take those categories, we're going to gut them from the inside, and we're going to fill them with the love of Christ, and they're going to be fundamentally different. Because people are no longer going to be transactional. Jesus wants to serve you. You say, oh, so then I'm in charge. We just can't get away from it, can we? Why does Jesus want to serve you? Because he loves you deeply, desperately, recklessly, indiscriminately. Do you love Jesus? Do you want to serve him? You need to surrender your will. You need to stop trying to protect yourself. You need to submit to him. You need to follow your heart right now. And I think right now, your heart deeply wants this new version of humanity. I don't think you can hear this as a Christian and say, oh, that would be wonderful. I want that. You need to follow that. That's telling you. You need to respond to his love with love. You need to respond to his submission with submission. You need to give yourself to him deeply, desperately, recklessly, indiscriminately. You need to tell Jesus, there's no more I. There's no more mine. There's no more I want, I say, I demand. There's only your will, your good, your benefit. That's salvation. That's heaven. That's real, true reality. That's what it really looks like. What you see in the world today, exemplified or illustrated in marriage, in children, in slavery, in the job place, in every relationship you see in the world, that's not reality. That's misery. Now, every fiber in your being practically is telling you to run the other way. But there's something that's telling you that this makes sense. Leslie Newbigin, in his seminal book, Foolishness to the Greeks, wrote, "The king reigns from the tree." The reign of God has indeed come upon us, and its sign is not a golden throne, but a wooden cross. The king reigns from the tree. This is how marriage is supposed to work, because this is how Jesus and the church works, and we're that reflection. Stand with me and let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for your Son and his unspeakable example, for his incomprehensible love, tenderness, mercy, humility, submission. Thank you for loving us when we were not only unlovely, but we were hateful and enemies. Father, help us to respond to your love in love, to respond to your submission with submission, not just to you, but to you first, and then to all our brothers and sisters, our wives, our husbands, our children, our servants. That everywhere we go, we would gut out the categories of the world and we'd fill them with the new reality of your kingdom, so that they reflect and that they're captivated by your love. We ask these things in the name of Jesus, who we desperately, recklessly love. Thank you for being here.